It is kind of amazing to be in San Francisco and have people that go back to when I was teaching at Hunter in the late 80s. So I am delighted to be here again, and I hope I will be interesting and understood. What I really want you all to understand is that the world east of the Mediterranean, as many of you already know, is a very complexly interwoven world, that the concept of Western Europe doesn't end when it hits Syria, and that the concepts of the East don't remain only in the East, but travel, and that there are trade routes that are incredibly important to this throughout time. It's not like they suddenly start or suddenly end. They're alive today. I'm going to focus on the period that goes with the exhibition Byzantium and Islam, which was the first generations, the 7th to the 9th century, of the rise of Islam and its move along those routes, both east and west, to have a profound effect that lasts on the world today. And also to move a little north of what I talked about 3 years ago, to not only explore a southern trade route that goes largely down the Red Sea, but also to look at the northern trade route, which is dominated by the Armenians. And they all in these centuries are initially feeding into the Roman Empire. At the very beginning, the Roman Empire's capital is in Rome, Italy, which is what we think of when we say Roman Empire. But then in the period that I study, the empire is legally moved to New Rome in 330 AD, Constantinople, that is now Istanbul, Turkey. And what I hope that I can coherently, because it is complex, explain to you as we do it, is how you move from the Emperor Justinian in the 6th century, who we do or do not know, but one of the reasons people do remember him is that his reorganization of the Roman law, the Codex Sinaiticus, is the legal code of the French government today. So while he is doing this from New Rome, Constantinople, he has a lasting impact on the West, and the great wealth of his empire is the silks he is wearing. And you follow the trade route from Constantinople, his capital, and his western capital that we will discuss, Ravenna, which I'm not finding, over here, and then all the way east to this grave goods in the Uyghur region of China, where if you look in the Byzantium and Islam catalog, you'll see that he's wearing silks that have motifs that we would associate with the classical world of Rome, not what we would think of as coming from China itself. And I should say that for any of my earlier catalogs, if you go to the Met Museum's publication section online, so metmuseum.org, then art, then publications, you can download them for free as a PDF if they interest you, or look at them and page through them, or find them on sale if they're still for sale some places. We're going to look at trade routes that go through this northern route, through Armenia and east, and we're also going to look at the trade routes that end in Constantinople but begin in Alexandria and come down the Red Sea and go to India, where they would still collect silks, but more importantly, they collect black gold, and black gold is pepper. We just buy it for nothing, but it was an incredibly important and desired good. And when we are following these trade routes, the connections aren't always very easy for us to see. It's not like everything goes out with a USA stamp on it so you can see how the USA marches. And one of the great examples that we have of that at the Met is our very Egyptian-looking Temple of Dendur. And one reason, of course, that Egypt was willing to give the Temple of Dendur to the United States when the Aswan Dam was built was that from an Egyptian point of view, it's a Roman monument. To us, it is a very Egyptian-looking, small, charming temple. But what it celebrates is the Roman conquest of that part of Egypt. And the hieroglyphs on the inside are fascinating because they start with just glorifying the Roman emperor, because they're in the middle of a transition of who's going to be emperor. And then by the end, it's the Emperor Augustus. So this is roughly the time of the birth of Christ, of the Christian era. It is an evidence of how far down the Nile the Roman occupation reaches, the change in the government of Egypt from the world that it is used to, which itself is not Egyptian. What we have to always remember is that in the 4th century BC, Alexander the Great moves from Macedonia, northern Greece, out, tutored by Aristotle, and he moves out trying to reach all the known world, particularly where the world is really rich, India and China. And his advance leaves an incredibly lasting remark on this world. And one of the things is that when he dies, his generals carve up the empire he has conquered. And in Egypt, you establish, in the 4th century BC, the Ptolemaic dynasty. So the gods of Egypt may still be the classical gods of their pharaonic era, but it's equally the classical gods of the Greco-Roman world. And this tunic top, so I would be across here if I was wearing it, is evidence of that. And it's a really wonderful piece because it's woven in a town that, if you read about the Christian era, which is usually called the Coptic era, in Egypt, it's described as coming from the town of Akhmim. And that sounds so distant and other to us. But when it was woven in somewhere between the 3rd and 5th century, that town was called Panopolis, Pan City, the Greek term, and it was a major cult center for the god Dionysus. So what we're looking at is quite possibly part of the ritual garment of a priest there. And you have Dionysus being pulled by his very chubby panthers in his chariot as he went to conquer India, which is a very popular theme in the worship of Dionysus in Egypt. And here is a faun with his legs and 2 maenads in the midst of one of their ecstasies in the worship of Dionysus. And this gentleman whose hands are tied behind his back, so he is quite possibly a captive Indian. And then at the bottom, those kind of Disney-like dolphins that show you you've reached the end of the world. That type of image does reach as far as India in some different ways that we don't fully understand. And we have to remember that when these images travel, sometimes they travel with us understanding what they are, and sometimes we have absolutely no idea when they get to us what they are. But one way they travel with learning is that a classical education does not remain, as an earlier generation would have argued, only within the Mediterranean basin. When I was in graduate school, you were still arguing that if you reach the city limits of Alexandria, everybody quit speaking anything that went with sophisticated Greek culture, and they were all kind of bumpkins. But this nasty little rock is actually excavated by the Metropolitan Museum of Art from the garbage heap of the monastery of Epiphanius at the beginning of the 20th century, which is way down the Nile, even further toward Nubia than the city of Pan. And what it is a man practicing, probably not a woman, his Greek. So he is sitting there writing the first line of the Iliad over and over at a site which maybe, it certainly made it into the monastery's garbage heap. And the monastery was discovered because the Metropolitan Museum of Art was looking for the pharaonic temples that were under the monastery. And we know that early Christian hermits went out to confront demons, and what better place to confront demons than in deserted temples of another religion. And Epiphanius is not one of the most important monasteries, but it is reasonably important. We brought back our part of the division of the material. The other part is still largely in Egypt, and published the translations of all these texts, unfortunately, right as World War II started, so people were not overwhelmingly interested in what had been founded Epiphanius as they were fighting a war, and we've failed to pay enough attention to it. But what we find increasingly, and what this generation of scholars is looking at, is that Alexandria, which is the Harvard, Yale, Oxford, Sorbonne of the ancient world in the beginning of the Christian era, is not a little bubble surrounded by people who know nothing. It is, in fact, deeply interwoven into the culture that is Ptolemaic through Cleopatra, and then Anthony is the beginning of the Roman era. And that mixture of the Ptolemaic world, the Roman world that's advancing, in Egypt moves into the Pharaonic world that is way before what I am talking about, but which itself, of course, was a major element on trade routes. And when you go toward Iran, modern Iran, you find evidence of the trade routes that reach back in time to the 6th century BC. The Achaemenid dynasty is what I'm showing you in the large tombs on that wall that look to us like a cross shape, and you wonder what it meant to them. Those are the tombs of some of the great rulers of the Achaemenid dynasty, names that we know today, Xerxes, Darius, and they're at this wonderful site near Persepolis, where if you stand, this big wall is on this side and not quite easily in view, but still not very far away. To the other side is another set of walls with carvings also, and then it's just this flat plain. And you know that trade goods moved through that area, funding, among other things, Persepolis. And these were both the tombs of great rulers and an advertisement of a type for the importance of the dynasty they represented. And that dynasty is the one that is destroyed by Alexander the Great. So we're looking at things way before the period I'm supposed to be talking about today. But beneath them, another generation of rulers did their advertising campaign too. And they are talking about how they are great rulers, and they are great rulers in the tradition of the dynasty whose dead are above them. And it doesn't look like these are altogether so big for you, but that's because my husband went way back to take the picture. And the lower ones are way above your head. The upper ones are way, way above your head. So they are really quite compelling when you are looking at them. And we are going to look most specifically at this one today. They have very nice signs there if some of you I know are thinking about going to Iran again or have been. And one of the things that I found so wonderful about the country is its second legal language is English. So the signs are in very nice English. And what we can't read at all. But this is what we were looking at on that wall. And this is the Iranian ruler, Shapur I, who is at a moment when it looks as if the Persian Eastern empires will perhaps conquer the Western Roman Empire. And so Shapur, in something that looks tremendously like Western chaps, is mounted on his magnificent horse with his protective deity kind of erased by centuries of rain to the behind him. And the two men that are kneeling and standing in front of him offering homage to this Persian ruler are Roman emperors. And this is at a moment in the 3rd century where for the first time the Romans are losing really important battles. And the standing figure is the Roman Emperor Philip the Arab. And what we forget how many different places Roman emperors come from. They don't all grow up in Rome and its immediate suburbs. I find Philip the Arab particularly fascinating because while the Arab part is that his mother is from a powerful Syrian clan, it's actually a clan whose roots are in Yemen. And so this whole route down the Red Sea is embodied in him, and he simply has to pay money. But the kneeling figure is the Emperor Valerian, who loses a battle to the Arabs, to the Persians in Edessa, the modern Edessa, and he's taken captive. So when you go to Persia, you can go and see the little town that's all that survives, a set of ruins, where he spent the rest of his life. And he perhaps sent it as a very elegant captive, or maybe his life was not so wonderful. It's an honor to be the bodyguard, to the horse holder of an emperor, but it's probably not as much of an honor if you yourself had recently had people kneeling to you. So this is a very pivotal moment, and the memory of important people, the aristocracy riding horses, is just universal. You see it at Show Inn, you see it among the Roman world, you see it in the Greek world, and in the bowl that you all have here, you see it in a bowl that's from around 1100, I think, since I've forgotten my pieces of paper with my notes, and it's from Nishapur. And the interesting thing about Nishapur is it's a town founded by Shapur I. And when your piece is made, it's no longer even the first generation of Islamic rule. It's in fact another group of people from the east, the Seljuks, who would have had no real history of this, but clearly these type of memories are very much a part of the peoples of the region, and they become important. And this is also from your collection, and this is a coin of the reign of Shapur I. So on one side you're seeing a portrait of him, and on the other side you're seeing a fire altar. Shapur I, the Sasanian dynasty that he is part of, revives the Zoroastrian faith that goes with the Achaemenids. It's earth, air, fire, and water, and the duality of good and evil. It's a very powerful faith in its own time. It's very widespread. It survives a little bit in Iran today, but more fully in our mind among the Parsi of Bombay, Mumbai, in India. And it is one of the influences that we underestimate when we think about what is happening to what seems to be a more purely, easily understood classical world. And the capital of this Sasanian empire is Ctesiphon, which you see in the ruins that survive, or did survive. And most of it, if you look at all of this area, if I cut that out and said to you, is this from Rome or is this from the Persian Empire, you'd say, I'm not sure. So what is truly distinctive are these giant vaulted iwans, kind of audience reception halls. And those never die. When the first generation of Muslim rulers take the capital and build their own capital, Baghdad, just a few miles away, they move these things, which must have been incredibly imposing to everyone, into the construction of their mosque. And this is the Friday Mosque of Isfahan in its modern form. So you've got centuries and centuries, as you do in any religious monument, of updating it by the devout of their own time. But the original core with these iwans is clearly an answer to Ctesiphon's buildings. And this is where all of the Muslims in the community came on Friday to get the information from the ruler or from the imam of what was happening and what would be happening. And it's a building type for a mosque that one would associate particularly with a Persian tradition. the elements here are in the Met and are thought to have been brought from Ctesiphon. And if you look at somebody writing in the late 1800s, they will assure you with no trouble at all that this is a rigidity and a lack of naturalism that is typical of the East, and that in comparison, the noble people of Greece and Rome are all for naturalism. And that's not altogether wrong, but maybe what we would be looking at more is when you are doing something to be an official person, as this room is an evocation of an official space, you're more rigid, you're more formal, you are showing your authority by being formal, and that the naturalism versus lack of naturalism maybe has more to do with use, and particularly Pharaonic Egypt. A colleague of mine showed through all sorts of small, intimate objects that they knew exactly what a deer looked like, and they could do a perfectly good-looking deer that was totally naturalistic. But when the Pharaoh was showing his authority, he was rigid. And they were perfectly capable of carving a hole in a piece of stone so that they could have a free leg. It's not an invention that only occurs when you look at Greek culture. What you see in Greek culture is that naturalism is made an authority figure. And that was something the Pharaonic world didn't do. So we're resorting all of this. It's a very exciting time, in my opinion, in scholarship to think about this. And one place where we're doing a lot of resorting is a site called Dura Europos, which is most easily understood for Americans, I think, if you think of it as the Alamo. It is a fort about 30 meters above the Euphrates River that stood on the barrier between Rome and the rulers from the east. At the moment it was built, it was the Parthians. And it's built by the Parthians, so it's to stop Rome advancing. And in 165, Rome advances and takes the site. Must have irritated the Parthians to have lost their fortress on the river. And about a century later, a little less than a century later, there is a very determined march by the Persian side to retake Dura Europos. And they know they're coming. There's nothing they can do. They know this army is advancing. They know they will get no more reinforcements than they have there, and they cannot just give up the fort and turn around and go home. You see that it's not very big, and that it has walls along the side that doesn't have a gorge, so it's a limited amount of wall. What I'm showing you is a pre-recent period photograph, because I really can't stand the current photographs of the site, which look like it has been hit by missiles. It's the number of people who have gone in and looted it, digging lots and lots of holes, trying to see if they can find anything else. But in the 3rd century, when the Persians are marching on the Romans, they take this wall and make it much wider. They just pile dirt on top of the buildings that are against the walls. And so when the Persians sweep through in the 250s and conquer the site and take all the people that are there and either have killed them or turned them into slaves, they then flatten the town. And they flattened the classical temple in this area that would have represented the official religion of Rome. But who's going to bother to uncover what was up against the walls, which would have been relatively minor communities? And it helps us understand that when we want to talk about the Persians versus the Romans, as I'm doing, we are simplifying the world, that there are all sorts of other communities that are relevant and important, but not the voice of the state. And what they found when they started digging out the wall was the relics of 3 of these religious sites. And the excavations go on over a long time. We begin digging in this part of the world when either the Germans build railroad tracks through the region and you find things, or later World War I needs flat spots to anchor their cannons, and you discover floor mosaics particularly. When this site is found, everybody's very happy with the small Mithraeum, the god Mithras, who with the slaughter of the bull is reemergence, regenerance, and is a religion particularly popular with soldiers. So it would make sense that it is there. And then they found a site that they didn't know what to do with, because this is the book of Moses, and with Martin Luther, who lives far after any of this has occurred, when he makes his break with the Catholic Church, he states what early Judaism was and what early Christianity was, and what they had in common against the church of his day, the Catholic Church, was they had no art. Good Jews and good early Christians had no art, and so we were going to reform the church to being good by getting rid of art. And that's why you get whitewashed churches in Holland in the 17th century. And in the 19th century, that argument's still very much alive. And your scholarly debates are what becomes early Christian, what did the Christians do. The Jewish community, very much scholarly community, agrees that they have no art. Protestants agree that when they were good, they had no art. And Catholics, of course, have to defend the position that there was always art. And that's still alive and being highly debated in the middle of the 20th century. So Germans put out books on what's art, Catholics put out anti-books, and then those of us who are studying art history read all these things. When this site is first discovered, they don't know what to do with it. When they decide what to do with it, the first impetus is to say it has to be a church. And that doesn't work very well, because this is destroyed in the 3rd century and Christianity is not legalized till the beginning of the 4th century. But that was the first desire. And then around the First World War, it becomes exceptionally clear that this is a synagogue, that this is a site of Jewish worship for a community that's got some good money. I mean, they're not the richest people in town, but they have paid for artists who are relatively good artists, particularly when we see the Christian site next. And that within this site, where the Torah niche has a perfectly nice seashell that you'd be happy to put Venus on, the narrative of the book of Moses includes his being found by a very naked lady in the little basket that looks kind of like a building. He's being found, and then he's being taken out of the water, and that's down here very near to the Torah niche. And above it here is the crossing of the Red Sea. And if you look at these figures, they are dressed as Roman elite. They are dressed like a Roman senator with the clavi that make them part of the official world. So this is not a Jewish community which is identifying himself by what maybe in the time of Moses people would have worn. This is people identifying their elite by what the elite of the world they were in wore. And God's hands are reaching down, which we're all assured could not have been true. And then you have the army, and you have the stick dividing the Red Sea. And we're still debating exactly what this is. One of the latest ideas is that more than anything else, this is the triumph of the Israelis as opposed to all the other people that were saying it wasn't going to happen for them, and has only that context. What is a part of the reason we have these debates is that a century after this was destroyed, we began to have a lot of early Christian sarcophagi to hold the dead with the crossing of the Red Sea on their facades. And they are on it as a symbol of universal baptism and salvation. So how does one read this against that? You've only got, the narrative has only got so many characters in it. There's no Pharaoh in this one, which is part of the reason that it's thought to being kind of attacking those who thought they could not succeed. Stephen Fine at Yeshiva University in New York has just written a book on this recently. We still haven't found a way to bring the art of the early Jewish world into our conversation comfortably, because we were all told for so long there was none. And part of what's forcing that forward is Israel. Because the more archaeological digs that Israel does in Israel, the more floors you find which have to be synagogues and which have, as here, human figures. That's a sun god. These are zodiac figures. And yet you have the menorahs and the Torah niche, so it cannot be handed off on the Christians. And we are trying to explore that more fully. And so this, which came to Byzantium and Islam in part, is Jewish and a synagogue, and also was first called a church, and it's from North Africa. And it too was found in the late 1800s. And on both of these floors, there's nothing on this that you couldn't have on the floor here. On a Roman floor, on a Greek floor, on your house's floor, on a place of worship. It's how you read them. Lions are always symbols of power. Fountains and trees are always kind of auspicious and paradise-like. And floors with vines, often grapevines, are just all over the world. But one of the most exciting ones, it's a very new discovery, it's within the last 5 or 10 years, is at Hukok in Israel, where suddenly we have a floor which is a series of narrative images. And the lower zone has a battle scene. The middle zone is this series of figures whom one argument would say that this gentleman still dressed in the clavi, that would make him a ranking figure in the Roman world, is the chief rabbi. And that he is actually the one who, according to one legend, met Alexander the Great. And if that's true, then this figure who is dressed in the zone above as a Roman emperor of the 4th, 5th, 6th century is possibly Alexander the Great. And he is leading elephants. And we know that in this period, the Persians fight with elephants. So are we looking at Alexander the Great, or are we looking at a battle that is more recent that we aren't identifying? A vast amount of discussion is going on about this, but what it does for sure is it takes that narrative wall at Dura Europos and moves it into Israel as a flat floor, and it's more evidence that Dura Europos is not a weird unicum of odd Jews who aren't part of the larger Jewish community, which was, in many ways, the earliest and quickest way to get rid of them. If you're unique, then you're irrelevant. And the last group at Dura Europos are the Christians. And they've got a place a little larger than the Mithraeum and a great deal smaller than the Jewish site. And its remnants are now at the Yale University Art Museum, because the dig in its last generations was in part done by Yale. And what you had at the end of these digs was partage. The best part was supposed to stay in the country of origin. The next best went with the people that did the dig. And then often the third part was sold at auction to pay for the expenses of the dig. And so Syria kept the synagogue, and hopefully it is still in very good condition in the museum in Damascus. And Yale took the Christian site. And in the newest reinstallation, they've taken apart a lot of the later addition of what should have been there, and thus are forcing all sorts of questions again. Maybe this is a baptismal niche. Maybe these are ladies going to the three Marys going to the tomb of Christ. This is definitely a good shepherd, so maybe that's a symbol for Christ, because the good shepherd is an early symbol. And these are the type of miracles, the man who is healed and picks up by Christ, so Christ and the man, and then picking up his bed and being able to walk again. Whatever these are, they are Christian, Jewish, Mithraic, and they are there before 260. And you have to find a way to deal with them to be accurate. And those communities, following the Ptolemies, following the Roman conquest, the Christians spread. Also, they spread largely in the first generation by slaves, merchants, and soldiers. Your elite is not Christian. And then as the Battle of the Milvian Bridge occurs, as Constantine the Great becomes emperor of the Roman Empire, a boy probably from Serbia, and he legalizes, he does not adopt Christianity as the state religion of Rome. He legalizes the practice of Christianity within the Roman Empire. You have a growth, and you have the movement of the empire to Constantinople. You have the Christianity be the major church of that new city. And in Egypt, you have, in the first years after the death of Christ, the tradition that the apostle Mark goes and becomes the apostle to the Egyptians. And we think of Mark with St. Mark's in Venice, but that is a later stealing of the body after the arrival of the Islamic period. In the first centuries, Mark is very popular and important in Egypt. And this work in the Louvre may show him with the elite of Alexandria, all respecting him. The members of the Coptic Church very much believe that that is the point in this image. And these two panels are from the, what we call the so-called grotto chair, because we don't actually know quite what it is, but it's very much telling you the story of the arrival of Mark in Egypt, where he breaks his sandal and he takes it to Ananias, the figure sitting here, who repairs it. And when this man who is not a Christian is repairing it, he hurts his hand. And Mark heals the wound that he's stabbed himself in some way. And that becomes one of his first disciples, and sufficiently an important disciple that then in another panel, the important person, St. Mark, is baptizing the second most important person, Ananias, in the presence of the lesser important people, so they are the smallest, in the River Nile. And he will become the second bishop of Alexandria with Mark's death. And in that generation, it's a universal Christian church. As there becomes a Church of Egypt, then the Church of Egypt identifies with the first bishop and makes Mark very much one of its heroes. And since it matters to realize that the Church of Egypt, the Coptic Church, does not begin with the beginning of Christianity. It's part of the great debates that are occurring, driven by Alexandria's intellectual elite, about issues that we now take as solved and argue about other aspects of Christianity. But in their time, people are working out exactly what Christians will believe. And of course, one of the great questions is, what is the nature of Christ? Is he a man? Is he a God? Is he, as the Nicene Creed says, both man and God? And the portion of the Christian community that take the mainstream position, which is the Nicene Creed, written for the Emperor Constantine in what is modern Turkey, kind of halves it. He's equally man, he's equally God. Some communities cannot adapt to accepting a portion of a God that could be a man, and the Church of Egypt is one of those. The Armenian Church will be another. They don't agree on why, but they both think that. These fights are occurring all over Egypt. All the churches in Egypt are not Coptic. Many are not. It will be, after the Muslim conquest, an increasingly Egyptian national church region. And in fact, the term Coptic is not a word that exists before the Muslim conquest. It's a Muslim Arabic corruption of the word Egyptos. So in the centuries up to the 7th century, you have all sorts of communities arguing. You could think of San Francisco. Think of how many different Christian churches there are. One of the sites where the Church of Constantinople, what we call the Orthodox Church, survives is in the Sinai Peninsula at the monastery of St. Catherine, which, as you can see, is in a deep wadi where there's water, because you can see that the trees are doing pretty well. And this is according to tradition where Moses received the laws on one of these mountain peaks behind it. And we know that very early on, this site, which is again on trade routes and people are going through it, becomes a community of hermits who, by the time of the Emperor Justinian, are a monastery of a type which is then walled in the era of Justinian, and he builds them this church, which has quite beautiful mosaics inside of it. And it is a major religious site. It's a major stop on the trade routes. What it is famous for in those centuries is helping to answer the nature of Christ. Because if the issue is, can Christ be both man and God, what you have to find is evidence that a God can be contained in something that is of the natural world. And because that's the issue. How can a woman, and in this period women are not thought to really participate in childbearing, they are in fact supposed to be a receptacle in which the male-generated child grows. So how can you put a God into a mere receptacle and have that receptacle not be destroyed? And the answer is the burning bush. If Moses sees God in the burning bush and the burning bush survives, then why can't the Virgin be the receptacle for Christ? And what Sinai has, when it was in these centuries dedicated to the Virgin, is the burning bush. This is the wall, and it's right about there, and it looks precisely like a very overgrown blackberry bramble. But whatever the plant is, it is very unique to the Sinai, and there are very few of them besides the one at Sinai, and it grows off of its own rootstock. So, in fact, the burning bush you see today, and you can see that so many people have been taking leaves from it that the monks got tired and went around and cropped them all off. But the roots of it actually go over to the inside of the church. So it's kind of ambled over the centuries. But it gives validity to the idea that the Orthodox community in these 4th, 5th, 6th centuries very much embraces, which is that the Virgin is the Mother of God. She is the Theotokos. And this is an argument that is relevant for us throughout this discussion. It is an incredible site today. It is the second largest collection of great art of the Orthodox world, and for those of you who know anything about it, it's where some of the very earliest icons survive that are so beautiful that then you have to argue, could you have painted them in the middle of nowhere, or did somebody bring them to you? And that's a good ongoing argument. And one argument for it being broad is this is a page from the Codex Sinaiticus, which you can see in the British Library, and is the typical thing that goes with history moving in confusing ways. This was taken from there by actually a Ukrainian scholar who gave it to the Tsar, who and had promised to return it to Sinai as soon as he had studied it. And then the Bolsheviks rise. The Bolsheviks take everything that belongs to the Tsar, and when Stalin needs money, he sells everything he can think of to sell, and the British buy this, and the monks want it back. And they're not going to get it back. But you also have this 19th century copy of kind of part of what helps this world survive. This is a copy of a copy of a copy of the hand of the prophet, who was supposed to be illiterate, so he would put his handprint to authorize something, and it is supposed to be authorizing the monastery's continuum. under the new regime of Islam. And it does thrive, and it does have abbots of all sort, and one of the ones that it picks in this period of the age of transition is a man from Yemen, because he can talk to those new invaders. And down the Nile, so not in the Sinai, but back toward Epiphanius, you have this new discovery, which is somewhat in Byzantium and Islam, and you can also just Google the Red Monastery on your website. It is a Coptic church, known to have been built within a complex that goes with St. Sanuta, who helps found the church that we call Coptic today. And what the local residents did in the centuries of increased Islamic rule and the lack of interest in figures was they built a wall in front of this so that they didn't whitewash their paintings, they just hid them. And at the turn of the 1900s, when the white monastery near it was surveyed by very good scholars looking for the origins of the Protestant church, so all that late bad painting was removed because it had to be late and bad. This was left alone. And we now, over the last 15 years, Professor Bowman, who's now at Case Western Reserve, has cleaned it. And this building is just fantastic. It echoes the designs of Constantinople. Are these sculptures? Is this a Gothic sculpture before Gothic sculpture? And this is the nursing virgin that we so often associate with Western medieval art. But in fact, it appears to be an image that began in Egypt, and it begins for Christ being given humanity by nursing from the Virgin, where in the Pharaonic tradition, the Pharaoh nurses from Isis and gains his divinity. So it's building on what the locals would want. And that community that we call the Coptic Church and the Orthodox that we've looked at a little are met with another Christian community who are what we now call the Church of the East. If you've read about it any time in books that are more than 5 years old, they will tend to be called the Nestorians. Nestorius was, in fact, the head of the church in Constantinople, when he took a position that did not approve of the Theotokos. And so he was deposed, and he was sent in exile to as far to the edge of the earth as they could send him, which was the cargo oasis between Libya and the Nile, where we have a lovely little exhibition on it right now at the Met that a graduate student working with me, Andrea Acci, has just installed. It's really quite wonderful if you're in New York. And what happens with the Church of the East is it simply does not condemn the writings of Nestorius, and over time they get called Nestorians. But those who are members of the Church of the East do not wish to be called after a man who actually was never a member of their church anyway. And so the correct term now is the Church of the East. What's important about the Church of the East is they are legal within the Persian Empire. They reach all the way across the whole Arabian Peninsula. They are a very powerful church, particularly among merchants. And one aspect of them, which you can just barely see on here, is that like Judaism and Arabic, they read from this side going that way. They read the reverse of the way we do. So this is the beginning of a Bible, and you can see all the pages that are to come. And this is the first page. To us, it looks like it ought to be the last page. We study them when they're pretty, as in the Rabula Gospels is part of the Orthodox tradition, and we're underestimating the degree we need to look at them more and to understand more exactly what they do. As opposed to Orthodoxy, they are like the Coptic Church and the Armenian Church. They are both part of in the beginning, and then they divide just like Protestants and Catholics do a millennium or more later. One of the things about this community that's most interesting is that they are merchants that go along the trade routes. And they are infinitely well involved. I'm trying to make my break time with an end of an idea, with the official church. So it's hard to know when you're really looking at something that's different. Oops, excuse me, wrong thing. Here You have a floor mosaic at Mount Nebo in Jordan, which is the site where Moses saw the promised land but could go no further. So it's a very major Christian community. And amazing, I swear that all of Jordan is a giant floor mosaic with not all of it dug up yet. And the people that do most of the digging are the Franciscans. And there was a Father Picciarelli that did so much of it. So these are probably part of the Church of the East. These may even be Arabs who serve in the Byzantine army, gain great rank, are Western Arabs. There are communities that serve in the Byzantine armies. Ghanasids are these. There are Nuthers that serve in the Persian army. They get titles, they go to school, they read and write, just like if you were picked up and sent to school in France. You would be reading and writing that even if you saw yourself as an American. And here, nearby at another church, this is in Greek and his name is Saola, and we know from he likes his name. He gives lots of things, and usually he puts down that he's a deacon, so we know his rank. But here is an inscription which is possibly Aramaic, but it's also possibly the earliest surviving inscription of in peace that's in Arabic. So the need to flow over between them is hard to follow, and that will go out to Ethiopia. And this is my last slide before break. We don't think of Ethiopia as part of this discussion when we're looking at trade routes in Persia and Rome. But what the kingdom of Aksum, which is in modern Ethiopia, has is control of the straits that take you out of the Red Sea to the black gold of Pepper. And they are closely allied with Constantinople. One of the first Christian nations are the people of Aksum, who are converted in a period that I find incredibly interesting. They, like the Armenians who convert a year or two, decade before them, they convert before the Roman Empire recognizes Christianity as a state religion. What is it that makes these two kings reject their Eastern forces that are pushing on them? Go with the West, but go with the West in a way that is not the state religion, is, I think, something that is dramatically understudied. This is a 14th century leaf that we own that is a copy of a probably 6th century lease that is still in Ethiopia. And what's fascinating about these is these are perhaps the tomb of Christ, certainly at Tempietto. They go at the very end of the Coda, the Canon tables that I showed you in the Rabula Gospels, which are an index to where you can find in the Bible, in the Gospels, the events in Christ's life every time it's mentioned by somebody. The parallels to these are in Carolingian Germany and in Armenia. So who is moving them, and exactly how do they move, and how much do we underestimate the importance of the kingdom of Aksum? In the Middle Ages, in the 13th century, we know that they have a major trading port of their own on the island of Cyprus, which is a great entreport for everybody. Each of these sites, this place that seems so distant at the end of the Red Sea, it's not something that comes up one day. Philip the Arab has relatives living in Yemen. When I was in Yemen, they have some colossal and quite beautiful statues of male nude heroes, rulers or gods, in their museum. And we don't quite know who those figures are. And in a figure that we'll look at again in another way in a few minutes, a man named Cosmas Indicopleustes travels through this region, and he talks about how as he goes down the Red Sea, there are all these monuments that once held sculptures on top of them, and their inscriptions are in Greek. So we are moving in a world that flows in both ways.